Welcome to the Academic Speaker Series. Tonight, Brauer is here to speak with us on queering education. This presentation is also part of the Sharks Week at Landmark, a week of awareness, education, and appreciation for the LGBTQIA community, which is sponsored by Sharks, He for She, and Landmark's Women's Center. For more information about these student clubs or the Women's Center, please contact via email or speaking to them, Maeve Spiegler or Tiffany Dyer. And also programs sponsored by these clubs this week are Anita Long on Gender Allies tomorrow, and you can view all these times on posters around campus. Wednesday, Sue Connolly from the AIDS Project on AIDS prevention. Trans 101 with Jay Hayes on Thursday, and on Friday, Pride in the dining hall. Brauer has lived in Vermont since 1986 and worked at the University of Vermont since 1992. She was just featured in the New York Times last month for her work in advocating for UVM to recognize a third gender option, work which has led UVM to taking steps to acknowledge individuals who identify outside the binary gender system. Those steps have included allowing students to select their own first names and preferred pronouns, including various gender-neutral options, and pronouns as in what they would like to be referred to as an individual. Brauer holds a master's degree in psychology from Antioch University, New England, and is now working on a doctorate in educational leadership and policy studies. Brauer will share her definition of queering education and argue for its role in keeping education relevant in the midst of cynicism and collapsing social structures. She will talk about the value of listening to voices that we may not have heard before. Thank you all for coming tonight, and let's welcome Brauer to speak.
So I want to thank you, Frankie, for that wonderful introduction, and thank Jeff Burgess for inviting me here before I was famous. And I want to thank Sarah Glennon and all of her students for inviting me to join you in your classroom today. So I'm going to try really hard not to say all the same things I said earlier to bore everyone. I want to thank Frankie Burney for, Meg Warren, I meant to say. Thank you, Frankie, for the water and the lovely gifts from Landmark. And I want to thank my partner, Anita Long, for just being a very fine partner and wonderful host, along with all of you who have been so gracious in welcoming me here today. So, I know you just heard a few things about me, but I'm actually going to start off tonight by introducing myself a little bit more. So here's my latest Throwback Thursday photograph. I grew up in Baltimore City, and I was a couple of the things that I think life experiences that helped shape me. And I thought I turned this off. Was that me or somebody else? Oh, it wasn't me. A couple of the things I think that have shaped me, because I think all of us are shaped, our ideas and our values, our ways of thinking are shaped by our life experiences. And one was that I grew up with a single mom in the 60s. At a time when our older brothers, and this is going to be the heavy stuff, and then we'll move on from there, but our older brothers were getting drafted into the military, and 50,000 of those young men who were drafted into the military died in Vietnam. And so that was part of what shaped my generation. My older brother did get drafted into the military. He did not die. He's still living happily in Florida. But we knew people whose older brothers died or were missing in action. Another thing that shaped me during that era was being a kid growing up during the Civil Rights Movement. I can think of two images that were seared into my mind when I was a little girl. They were other little children my age. One was the image of little children being hosed down with fire hoses by police officers and firemen in the streets of Alabama because they were protesting during the civil rights movement. And those little children may have been living very far away from me and fighting a fight that I couldn't fully understand as a little girl, but I felt very connected to them as children who were being subjected to something that didn't make sense to me. I also remember the photograph. It's a very, very famous photograph. If any of you are familiar with the old Historic Life magazine, it was this large format magazine. There was a photograph of a young woman, a little girl, about my age, who was running down the street naked with napalm burns on her body. She was a little girl in Vietnam. So it was kind of a scary world that I was growing up in. As I said, my mom was a single mom. We were extremely poor. There are people who are poorer than we were, but we didn't always have something to eat. We didn't always have socks and shoes and gloves and those kinds of essential things when it gets cold outside. And those things absolutely helped shape the person I have become. And I have learned to braid my hair so that it usually doesn't have quite those kinds of bends in them. But I still look kind of funny when I put on a dress. This is me after 16 years of education, and had kind of polished me up a little bit. And this is me when I went out into the world after college. This was my graduation photo. When I went out into the world to try to make my way with my one Evan Pacone wool suit and my pumps. I remember my interview with a vice president from Procter & Gamble who was explaining to me how I would be working with the Duncan Hines brand and trying to get the grocery store to sell more of the Duncan Hines brownies instead of the, I forget what the competitor brand is. Anyway, another brand, another mix of brownies. And I just kind of couldn't see myself in that role. And ultimately, I tried. I spent about 3 or 4 years working in corporate America, but ultimately left corporate America and I did a bunch of other things. And eventually became the person I am today, which to me is much more connected to that little curious girl who never stopped asking questions. So I wanted you to know a little bit more about me before I talk to you about what I think. Because I believe that context is everything, and I believe that this kind of formal, credentialized introduction really doesn't tell the whole story about a person. And honestly, I couldn't find a more recent formal photograph, so I had to stick that one up there, which is about 40 years ago. So, not quite. So, part of what I'm going to talk to you about today goes all the way back to when I was very young. This book was written in 1954, 4 years before I was born. And it's one of the stories I grew up with, along with everything else Dr. Seuss ever wrote. But this one was certainly one of the ones that really stuck with me, because it was a story of a hero. It was a story of a hero listening to the smallest of voices. And it spoke to something very core to my experience of having felt very small and having felt very much in need of a protector. And so there's something about that whole image that has guided everything I've done, certainly in my work at the University of Vermont, first for 9 years as a mental health counselor, and then for the past 14 years as the director of the LGBTQA Center. Listening to every voice deeply, no matter how small, and making commitments to take care of those to every person in every community and believe in their story is absolutely a central theme for me, and something that I believe should be central to the learning of every person on the planet. Now, something that has become, for me, has become, I think, a real factor in education, in schooling, in learning, certainly for queer people, is the fact that while when I was growing up, it was impossible for me to find anyone else who felt the way I felt, who wondered some of the things that I was wondering, who had some of the same uncomfortable feelings with some of what I was experiencing around me. Today, if you're a queer who, you can find a Whoville. You can find a Whoville out there through the internet, through Tumblrs and tweets and Facebook, and there's a connectivity that just didn't exist when I was growing up. Even adults who were LGBTQ, who existed outside the mainstream, had a hard time finding each other, but children had no opportunity, and young folks had no opportunity, no mobility, no way to connect. So today, you can actually find Whoville, and I think that is making a huge difference. And every single voice has an opportunity to be heard today. And folks are taking radical advantage of that. So they're publishing their own YouTube videos, and they're publishing their own, creating their own blogs and their own Tumblrs, and they're experimenting with their own creative voices. And I think that is creating a kind of a noisy anarchy out there in the world of knowledge and sharing that some people find very frustrating. Some folks who are used to being kind of in charge and in control of the knowledge process find some of what's out there on the internet troubling, or something that they're not sure what the value of it is. I think that it's creating a conversation that's incredibly exciting. So, I want to back up a little bit. I was in college when this phrase first was being used, so I wasn't paying any attention to Sesame Street at the time, and I missed this little piece of wisdom. I wasn't introduced to it until in the late 80s when I started doing LGBT trainings, but it was certainly a handy meme to use around the idea of what a person might experience if they show up in their class or in a group of friends or whatever and have this difference about them, right? So some people have talked about this this idea as being just about the condition of life. It's not easy. There are things in life that are hard, but to me this always meant about being different. Anybody else in the room read it that way? Yeah, great. I'm glad I'm not the only one. So, this is going to be the next part of what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to get a little geeky and sciencey on you here. So hang with me. So fortunately, we're in an era that is so much more enlightened than when I was first in college. There's so much more information out there that really helps us begin to understand humans not from such a what is that word? Unidimensional kind of way that really begins to grapple with how we understand each other across all of our differences. And this is just one of those really helpful theories. We're not going to get into the details tonight, but I'm just going to say that what stereotype threat talks about is the way when we are in any kind of setting where we are feeling like we might be evaluated, right? Classrooms being key among those, yes, right? And that's true for teachers and students, right? Depending on the circumstances. When we feel like we might be evaluated and we're made aware of a stereotype that might be a negative stereotype that might be associated with something about our identity. And that could be any stereotype. That can even apply to those of us who have more privileged identities, right? Even more privileged identities might have negative stereotypes associated with them. So whiteness, for example, is a privileged identity. And whiteness, a negative stereotype whiteness can have associated with it is being racist, holding a racist attitude. Okay, is everybody following my example? So if a white person walks into a room and is concerned that people might be evaluating them based on whether or not they hold racist attitudes, that fear or that worry is likely to cause them to feel kerfuffled. I used that word earlier tonight. What I mean here is distracted, even a little bit anxiety, and they might find themselves saying something that they wouldn't normally say. They might find themselves saying or doing something that would actually tend to confirm the stereotype. Okay, so that's how stereotype threat functions. And the thing that's wonderful about the theory, and any of you can go out on the internet and look up stereotype threat and actually find some amazing resources that can help you learn about this. The thing that's important about it is that now this research that's been done can really help teachers and other folks who are running camp counselors, whoever who are facilitating groups of people, can help them find ways to shape the experiences of the people in their groups in such a way that they help moderate and mediate the likelihood that that stereotype threat will arise in that situation, and limit the performance, make some of the people in the room feel less capable of performing at their full level. So that's pretty cool. We've got, anybody heard of stereotype threat before, by the way? Terrific. How about microaggressions? How many people have heard of microaggressions? Cool. Okay, so this term was actually coined back in 1970. See, Kermit and Daryl Wing Sue were clearly in communication with each other. No, it wasn't Daryl Wing Sue actually who came up with the term microaggressions. It was another researcher. But the incredible research that Daryl Wing Sue has done has really helped to demonstrate how important it is for us to begin to become aware of attitudes that we might, attitudes isn't really quite the right thing, ways, social ideas and assumptions that we may have absorbed simply by interacting with the culture, that if we hold a privileged identity, we're less likely to even notice the bias contained in those assumptions. And so we'll find ourselves repeating statements that we imagine to be innocent that actually express a bias towards someone else. The classic example is to say of an African American person, wow, you are incredibly articulate. Because there's an underlying assumption there that an African American person is somehow less likely to be articulate, right? Or saying to a person who's a woman, wow, you're incredibly decisive, right? The underlying assumption that a woman shouldn't necessarily be decisive. So Daryl Wing Sue's research has really helped demonstrate exactly how
because you want to focus, no one else should. That's a little bit.
Exactly how impactful those microaggressions can be, and how they can disrupt the learning experience for the person who feels targeted by them. And what that tells the rest of us is that there's a really great reason for us to slow down and listen to each other so that we can learn from each other's different perspectives and not make an assumption that there's one perspective on how best to frame things and communicate. My favorite person who speaks about this is Kenji Yoshino. Kenji Yoshino wrote the book covering hidden assault on our civil rights in 2006, I think it was. He's a great presenter, so if you want to look on YouTube, he's got a bunch of talks out there. I find him pretty fascinating, but maybe that's because I'm a little bit of a law geek, policy geek. Any other policy geeks in the room, I think you'll appreciate what he has to say. So he basically, as a law professor, has studied affirmative action law and came to the conclusion and wanted to share this with the general public that we kind of can't sit around and wait for policies and laws to make our shared spaces, our public spaces like our schools, our towns, our communities, become places where all of us can feel equally engaged and equally comfortable and equally free to be our whole selves. And that includes people with quote-unquote majority identities or privileged identities. Everybody, as he points out, has to cover aspects of who they are to feel okay in the world, in the spaces in the world that as they are constructed today. And he really challenges us to come together as communities and have those kinds of conversations and learn about each other's different perspectives so that we can create space to share those community organizations and spaces together. All right. Now, I think that Frank Baum, I don't know how Frank Baum wrote The Wizard of Oz, but I've read about Frank Baum writing The Wizard of Oz, and he says that he didn't really have any great allegory in mind, that he was really just writing a kid's book. At least that's the story that I read. But there's so much powerful symbolism contained in this story that for me gets down to my core beliefs about how to be in the world in any form of leadership, what responsibility leadership has to people. I said earlier today that there are different ways to imagine leadership. One way is authority and privilege, and another way is vision and accountability. And those are really very different. Because this is what I would say authority, the authority and privilege model can look like. And one of the things, does anybody remember what came just before this? When Dorothy and her friends, right, are all going and looking for help. Dorothy really, really needs some help from the wizard, right? Dorothy's in a bad way. She can't get home, right? Mm-hmm. She really needs some help, and the wizard's the only one who can help her in this whole place. Mm-hmm. And what does the gatekeeper say?
Go away.
Yeah.
The wizard says go away.
Yeah.
The wizard says go away. That's right. The wizard's the only one who can help her, and the wizard says go away. What's the message?
Go away.
Your problems don't matter, right? Yeah. You don't matter. Has anybody in this room ever felt like that?
I also find it, and she only matters when she does a favor for him.
Well, we'll get to that. Actually, we won't get to that, but you're right. What else does he say? Does anybody remember? What's that? Come back again tomorrow. Yeah, he says that. Nobody gets to see the wizard. No way, no how. Right? The wizard is this mystical being, right? Nobody ever sees him. So they get in and they see this guy. And he says, "Do not arouse the wrath of the great and powerful Oz." Right? And there's like all this smoke blowing, and what's the response of Dorothy and her friends?
I am Dorothy. This is
The lion jumped out a window.
What's that?
I believe the lion ran.
Yes, the
The
lion
lion.
runs and jumps out a window, that's right. They all cower on the ground, right? They're all like running and they're scared and any of you ever observed a form of leadership that was based in intimidation anywhere in life? Right?
My mother.
Okay, parents excluded.
Jim.
All right. So I grew up really thinking hard about what comes next in the film. Because the camera backs up, right? And it pans left, right? And wonderful Toto pulls back the curtain. And we find this silly old man,
Of course, the dog's the smartest one.
right? And that seared a message into my brain as a little kid. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain then was like a motto for me and has remained so my whole life. Right? So when you combine that with the conviction and courage of Horton, you can get in trouble. But, hopefully you live to see another day and fight another day. I've always held that idea that whoever is blustering and being so self-important is also just a person. Right? And so when you find yourself being seduced by your own importance, remember that, consider the possibility of invoking your inner Horton instead of your inner strange and intimidating, great and powerful Oz. So when I think about education and the space for queer people in education, the queer people have spent an awful lot of time being somewhat like Dorothy and having a hard time finding their way home. And they've run into a little bit more of the great and powerful Oz who was too busy sort of maintaining their structure in the way that it had always been to pay as much attention to the needs of those kids who were getting bullied. Has anybody ever seen kids get bullied and seen the organization not respond?
I've experienced that.
Right. So let's spend a few minutes talking about what queerness means. Because I'm not only talking about sexual orientation and gender identity. I'm talking about difference. I'm talking about that singling out that happens to lots of people, whether or not it's a sexual orientation-based difference. When you are seen as the one who doesn't fit, sometimes you are focused on with a kind of negative attention that has that kind of microaggression impact on you and that stereotype impact on you and keeps you from being your best self. Right? This is Webster's idea of what queerness means, right? And that was the noun. And then of course there's the that was the adjective. This is the noun and the verb. This isn't what I mean by queering education. I don't mean ruining it. I don't mean that at all. What I mean is really quite different. Let me go forward a minute. What I mean when I talk about queering education, I mean challenging and even transgressing accepted norms. Because if one of the accepted norms is we look the other way when kids are being bullied, that's an accepted norm that maybe could stand to be broken, right? So maybe we stop that. We interrupt that, right? That's what I mean when I'm talking about queering. It's resisting oppression, any oppression, all oppression, right? It's critically asking, is everybody getting to have a voice here? It's invoking your inner Horton. Are we listening deeply to what everybody needs to say here? And it's radical visibility. It's allowing everybody to show up. It's doing exactly what Kenji Yoshino is asking us to do by saying, you know what, nobody in this room should have to pretend to be something other than who they are to be here. We all deserve the space and the right to be here as who we are, with our full selves. Now, I skipped over this part. This goes back to why I think the internet is so involved in bringing about this moment where students are coming into classrooms with a whole set of understandings that sometimes their teachers haven't even witnessed yet. That's not always the case. Sometimes the teacher who's teaching a class is right up to speed, but sometimes they're missing some information that the student has. Anybody can tell me what this is?
Somebody said
Urban Dictionary. What is Urban Dictionary?
It's more slangy,
It's slang. What does that mean?
common language, not like formal language.
I'm sorry, say that again.
More of definition as written by us.
Definition as written by us, right?
Slang is the language of the layman.
Well, it's also the language of the people.
Layman
It's-
people.
It's not something, as I said in Sarah Glennon's class earlier today, it's not something that's being decided by a committee of people as being a proper definition, but it's words that are being used by people in life. And Merriam-Webster can't keep up with how language is evolving today, because it's evolving very quickly. So I cut off the bottom of this slide, but there were something like close to 2,000 different definitions of the word queer. And that might seem like just, to use a really 75-cent word, cacophony, right? A lot of noise, right? A lot of intellectual noise. But the fact is that that intellectual noise exists in the world. And for the first time, the internet allows us to listen in on it, right? And we're actually learning something about it. And that noise is more manageable to the younger folks who've grown up with that noise than to the older folks who are trying to dial into it. I would suggest, at least some of the time. And so younger folks are coming into the room with a different idea about what some of these terms mean than the folks who are teaching them are always ready for. So, I'm going to tell you a little story. So I've been working with transgender students since 2001 at UVM. They've taught me a tremendous amount. They've taught me everything I know about trans experiences in life and politics. And I mean, you know, they could write a lot more than I can about it, but I've become kind of well informed. And I've listened very closely to their voices. And one of the things that I've learned that didn't surprise me in the least was that they felt invisible in women's studies classes. If the women's studies class was talking about gender only in terms of the disadvantages women experience in relation to men. Now, so I wasn't surprised about that at all. And I figured, well, you know, maybe these students aren't telling the women's studies faculty member about how they see this. So I thought, well, maybe if I sit down and have lunch with this colleague who I have this 5 or 6 year collegial relationship with, they'll just say, oh, well, of course, why didn't I think of that? Can you point me to some resources, or I've got some resources, or whatever. What I was surprised about was when instead this faculty member said, well, there's a reason for that. We haven't achieved gender equality yet. Women are still fighting for their rights, which is absolutely true. We still don't have race equality in this country, right? People of color are still fighting for all kinds of equity, right? The civil rights movements are not over. That's all true. But I don't think that, it turned out in the long run that that was not really the issue. I tried this with another person and another person. I tried this with queer faculty, and every single one of them said, oh, this is going to be a tough issue. One of them said, you know, if we bring this up to faculty, they're going to get uncomfortable. And I finally said, okay, I really don't get it. I really don't understand what's going on. You're talking about people who study inequality, who study what happens when people are not made visible by not being included, right? If you're teaching gender and the economy, gender and the law, gender and health, then, my God, transgender people are the most systematically disadvantaged people out there. How can you not include their stories, their perspectives, their experiences? And they said, well, it's complicated. I said, I've got time. Explain it to me. And what they talked about was, in my mind, what they talked about was this. They talked about an institutionalized educational system that is such a big machine at this point. The machine of tenure, trying to get tenure, trying to get your PhD even, is so onerous and drills you down into such a tight little narrow body. And I'm not talking about the kind of tenure that would happen at a smaller school, a smaller private school, but when you get into the state university systems, the kind of track you get on and the hazing, intellectual hazing you undergo to attain this position that you start out maybe at your age thinking, I might like to teach someday because I love learning and I love knowledge. You get through those years and years and years where all of your ideas are narrowed down and down and down, and you get to this point where you're tired. You're tired, and if you have to take on one more area that you have to gain that kind of in-depth expertise into, it's just not going to feel worth it. Well, I mean, these are people who started out loving learning. These are people who started out curious. And these are people I generally respect as human beings. These are people who set out in life to be good people doing good things in the world. And somehow, something institutionalized is getting in the way of them being the kind of person I think they probably set out to envision themselves to be. Now, I want to say that these same people, once they had sat with these issues for over a period of time, came back and said, oh my God, here we are fighting to hold rigidly in place the very thing we set out to deconstruct. Rigid ideas about gender. That's what we set out to change. But this took months. And this took many conversations. That's not the kind of flexibility and an agile intellectual inquiry that we imagine we're engaged in the educational process. I don't think. So, when I talk about queering education, what I'm talking about is questioning and querying and critiquing the entire idea we have about how we do this. The whole idea about some sage on the stage, right? Some expert stands up and knows everything about whatever, because there is no such thing anymore. There's too much clamor of knowledge and information out there for anyone to know everything about anything. And so I think that one of the things we need to do is to probably do some of the things that you guys already do at Landmark, because this is a smaller space that's more intimate, that allows you to have a different kind of conversation than can generally happen in a Sociology 101 at a state university with 400 students sitting in an auditorium. It's very, very hard to have an authentic conversation where anybody in that room gets to show up. And I think part of what we need to do in education and in learning is to remember that learning is something that human beings do innately. It's something that we start out our very first breath doing. It's what drives us through our entire life until we're ready to lay down and call it quits. We learn. And we don't have to form it into some kind of this. We don't have to make it full of smoke and mirrors and self-importance. We can really keep it on a human level that invites and welcomes the curiosity of everyone involved, the smallest voice among them. So, I like to invoke our inner Horton, to hold on to that daisy, to believe in it, to listen deeply to those smallest of voices, to be aware of the voice you're not hearing in the room even, the voice that you know must be there but isn't speaking up. To be curious about that, to be ready for the monkeys and the kangaroos, because they exist among us, right? The folks who are like, no, 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 that we always have done it this way. This is the way we need to keep doing it because this is what we know. To be ready to say, yeah, but when that person says this is going to make that faculty person uncomfortable, to be ready to say, so what do we do about the fact that right now the students are uncomfortable? Right? Even if that person is your colleague or your friend. To be ready for the fact that sometimes you're going to get in trouble initially, until they've had time to sit back and think about it, and somebody else has come along and said it a different way, and somebody else comes along and says it another way, and we all do, the who's all get together, and that last little who with the yo-yo stops playing yo-yo and yells yop, and they finally hear what's being said, and they say, yeah, you know what? I get it now. And be aware that sometimes when the daisy is dropped into the field of daisies and you feel like you just can't listen hard enough to find that dust speck. You know, Horton didn't have friends, but hopefully we do. And we can call on each other and build our networks and look together and listen together. And sometimes we just have to go get some rest and come back another day. So, I'm going to end with one more piece of geeky research that I love. So, this is the reward we have waiting for us. As we manage to do this, as we manage to challenge our acceptance of established research, and we manage to say, wait a minute, there's something about that, it's not sitting right with me. It's making me curious about something. Can I ask a question? When we create more spaces where we all get to show up as ourselves, and we all get to bring our curiosity, and we get to question everything, especially the stuff that feels oppressive, what happens is that we think together, and our thinking together arrives at whole new possibilities that we couldn't imagine. And that begins to create a liberating kind of condition of creativity that the box, that institutionalized box of having to accept, having to work only within the accepted canon of knowledge can never lead us to. In fact, if anything, it may be the only thing that can save us from some of the holes we find ourselves in today for having followed some of those accepted canons. That's all I have for you. The question is, where is the transgender movement going? And I am not an expert necessarily on the transgender movement, but I do keep a pretty close eye on some things in the transgender movement. So if you ask a trans activist, they would know even more, because I have to be kind of a generalist for my job, so I have to keep an eye on a lot of different things. What I have observed, though, there are a couple of things that feel really important to me about that I've seen in the transgender movement. One of them is a real, and it's not universal, but there is within the transgender movement a lot of emphasis on identity intersections, and actually I see this across the board in identity movements. So I see it in anti-racism work, I see it in among bi, pan people and asexual people. There's a lot of discussion about recognizing and emphasizing the importance of identity intersections. And what I mean by that is seeing, I tried to express a little bit earlier about the fact that I can't really peel apart all the different aspects of myself. There's class, and there's gender, and there's sexual orientation, and this is what these folks who within all of the social justice movements are talking about, is that we've got to understand that all of us have a race, all of us have a class, all of us have learning issues. We're either super learning or difficult learning. All of you can easily understand how that aspect of your lives has affected you. So we all fall somewhere on all of these different identity areas, and you can't peel all of those things apart. You can't really know exactly what's driving when we feel like we're on top of our game and when we don't. You need to understand that people are whole beings. And so one of the things that I think is really helpful about the transgender movement is that there's emphasis in there that is trying to reach across the race boundaries and the class boundaries and the ability boundaries very, very intentionally, so that they can make the movement as inclusive as possible and as speaking across as many of these different life experiences as possible. Another thing that I think is very critical is the way in which the trans movement and the current generation of young folks' ability to just kind of roll with it, to just say, well, of course, gender isn't all this and all that. Of course, there's a spectrum of the ways people feel about gender. Is that it's helping surface the areas of the ways in which masculinity and femininity in their pure extreme forms are problematic for everybody, right? And really are the source. Frankie and Zach were talking earlier at dinner about the he for she movement, and how that movement's trying to challenge the ways in which men and women get pitted against each other, and the ways in which polarized ideas about gender really set people up for really problematic ways of relating with each other. And I think the trans movement is just adding to that conversation in very rich ways, because folks who are occupying gender space in between, in the middle there, are able to almost serve in the same kinds of ways that third gender folks have served in indigenous communities over the ages, of serving like a translational kind of, mixed race folks are doing the same kind of thing at times within discussions about race and racism, right? So you can serve that kind of translating role. Where the trans movement is going, those are the two big ones that come to mind for me and that make me really excited. Other ideas about that? Yeah.
Well, coming from I would say kind of heteronormative, I don't know what that means anymore, but background, I think one of the things that have been key is media. Like I watch like Orange is the New Black, and I watch Transparent, and those were two like wonderful ways in which the visibility of transgenders was just like smack right in my face,
Really? Right.
and high profile, and it was like interesting because when I actually had scrolled over Transparent because I didn't think it was gonna be like relevant to me.
Right.
And then you told me I would totally love it. So then I watched it and I was like, this is the best show I've ever seen. And then I started talking to people as if I know what transgender means because I watched it. But it's like, but ultimately it's like, it's a great way to break through to our generation is like, that I think we're more highly affected by something like that.
Right.
In the same vein of media, I think about some shows try but don't do it successfully. I bring up Glee for that. It tries, but it tries by putting forth stereotypes.
Right.
The gay men are stereotypes. The lesbians are the bisexual is a stereotype. The lesbian is a stereotype.
It made a breakthrough.
Yeah,
I
it
think
made-
it was a
yeah,
breakthrough.
I
You
think-
make a good point.
Yeah.
But I think you made a point because it's like, think about, that's ABC Family,
Yeah,
and then Transparent was made by Amazon.
yeah.
So the viewership is totally different,
Yeah.
and also you're thinking of marketing, you're thinking of who's paying for my
Yeah.
advertising.
Right.
I have all this creative like
Yeah.
liberty in Transparent where I can actually do it
Yeah.
right. And then Glee, I have to have straight people feel comfortable watching it. So I'm gonna have the black girl be big and be funny and loud, and I'm gonna have the gay person like do all kinds of,
Fashion
affectation.
and-
Yeah, because I'm still trying to sell to
Yeah.
like a person, right? But
Right.
and as you're saying, there might be still some good in it though, because then at least
Yeah.
I saw, I
It's
still
good
have.
that, again, I'm saying, it's good they tried, I think to properly just have a discussion, you can't have stereotypes. You have to have people.
Right, I mean, I think this is the discussion, exactly what you're talking about here. And it's been the discussion about sort of network television and when it's doing good and when it's doing harm, right? I mean, that was way back in the 80s, I think, when Sanford and Son was on, and what were some of the other, even
All in the Family?
All in the Family, thank you. There have been a handful of these shows that have really, they've gotten all their humor out of stereotypes, right?
The Jeffersons, that was a big one.
Right, the Jeffersons, right.
I was gonna say, even though it's more common, I look at less Doctor Who and Moffat didn't kind of, but like even though Captain Jack Harkness does that's not at all his entire personality. That is a small fraction of. He's homosexual, but the fact that he's basically attracted to everyone isn't his entire character. It's-
Captain Jack Harkness is
Doctor Who.
the spin-off of Doctor Who.
Yeah.
Oh.
It's and John Barrowman.
Torchwood,
If you like,
Torchwood.
John Barrowman is great. He goes, I'm a gay man, homosexual alien hero who's beloved on both sides of the globe. What's not to love about that?
Right, and this brings up the wonderful thing about science fiction, that science fiction can go places that is
There
hard
was
to
a
go.
lesbian
right. And,
there was
and somebody raised something really interesting the other day, that I bumped into the other day, that Doctor Who is reconstituted every however long, right?
Yeah.
Every year or two, right? Into a new character.
Yeah.
Why has that character never been anything but a man?
That's what I've always
Yeah.
wondered.
Right? Right? So, I mean, these are questions
Yeah.
that your generation is
Now we get to
asking.
answer,
When the
right?
fans,
Right?
when a
James
lot
Bond
of
gets
fans
the black.
wanted a woman.
Right, why has James Bond never been
Well,
black?
repetition and difference, like the idea of
Yeah.
now we need to start thinking about what's countercultural, what's now, I know like counterculture now becomes culture, mainstream, it's,
That's right.
like sexy doesn't have to have a race tied to it, and soon it won't have to have a
Right.
gender nor a, I think so, as you're saying, I really love that you said that these public spaces won't naturally progress to that.
That's
'cause
right.
I know so
We have to
many
make them
people
progress.
who think that we are on a natural line towards social progression, and it makes me infuriated because, well, those people tend to be in pretty privileged places to say that. So I'm like, I would love to wait 100 years for everyone to die out, and I don't
There's
think
a-
that's
Better
true.
that you have
I think
to
that
wait.
people in
You
my
have to-
generation are effed up too about race and
Like,
class
you have to
privilege.
get better,
I
but you have to
don't
let
think
them
they
get
have that
better.
too, and it's like,
Right.
yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead.
So how did you create the change that is created on the campus of UVM? You talked
Yeah.
about,
Yeah.
research shows that.
Okay, does anybody know how a starfish opens a mollusk?
Oh,
Anybody know how?
It wraps itself around it,
And then what?
and then it pulls it apart.
The pulse.
Yeah, and does it just go?
No. Slow.
Is it pulsate or?
It pulls and pulls and pulls and pulls with this steady tension
Yeah.
until the mollusk runs out of strength.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's how I did it.
I also thought that's how ancient, before we
That's
developed.
exactly how I did it.
Before we developed traps and distance weapons, that's how humans hunted. We were built for distance running, so we just outrun our prey.
Well, and you know, it's really helpful to think in these metaphors and to realize that sometimes you just have to be in it for the long game.
Yeah.
And if you if you knock on this door over here and you don't get where you need to go, you go home and you think about where is the next door you need to knock on, who is the next ally, and you just don't give up. And that's exactly how I've done everything I've done at the University of Vermont. I've never stopped and thought, one thing you never want to do, if you want to work in any kind of activist role, don't ever waste your energy beating your head against a wall. Because all you get is bloody and bruised and tired and a headache. So the minute you get it, that you're up against that brick wall, you say, okay, I've got these other 6 things I could be working on over here. But you don't put that away in a file. You keep it right here on a sticky note, right outside your peripheral vision. And the first time you catch anybody talking about anything related to this, you say, you know, we could really do this thing with our database system. The registrar said so. And they say, really? You say, oh yeah, you know, he said so to a bunch of students in front of the provost once. You just share the story, and you keep sharing the story in a new place, and a new place, and a new place, and don't ever think that if you don't get it done, it can't get done. Make it as large an effort and as big a conversation as you possibly can. I say to a friend of mine who works on these issues in the College of Medicine, never to worry about it if a person in a leadership role can't see their vision. Because leaders are just not chosen, they're not selected, and they're not coached to hear our vision necessarily. They're not coached to respond to social change. We feel the social change, and their job is to keep the fire lit in those things, you know, and keep the projector going with that big face. I mean, that's their job. That's what feels like their job, is to keep the edifice looking nice and polished and fancy. And so we're sometimes pulling away their resources. I'll get you in a second. And that can feel really challenging to them. And so what I do is share the story with more people like us, you know, until there are enough of us. It's sort of like teaching a song. Oh, anybody else like the, what's the, Mockingjay?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Hunger Games.
Right? That song,
Right.
right? That song she was singing, right? Sometimes you just have to, or you can go, you can go all the way back to slave, to the songs sung by people who were enslaved, to like give the message to the folks in the next field. Tonight's the night, right? Right? You teach the song, you teach people the lyrics and the melody, and then everybody starts singing it, and before you know it, they got to do it.
Great.
Yeah, you had your hand up for a while.
It's one thing that I've always run into during this discussion is the confusion between alignment, what you are, either pan, whatever, and the idea of what your gender is. How do you teach that difference and make sure that that confusion doesn't, because that's one of the most common confusions when this discussion is brought up.
That between gender identity and sexual orientation?
Bingo.
Yeah, so, yeah, I think it's getting easier than it was when I first started this in 2001, so that's a good thing. But I always say, I always try to orient the person to identity, what identity is as a felt experience, an inner felt experience, and that it also has this other aspect that is about what people's perception of us is, and those don't necessarily align. And so I start them there. I say, just, we all have these identities. And then I say, and one of those has to do with where we are with how we express ourselves in terms of our masculinity or femininity, or some blend of that. And I say that's about gender, and that's gender, there's gender expression, there's how we behave, how we conduct ourselves, and that affects a lot about how we're perceived, but there's also this inner feeling. And when we're comfortable, we're probably expressing ourselves in a way that lines up really well with our identity. So that's the gender identity piece. And then the sexual orientation is about who we're attracted to.
Yep.
Right? It's who we're attracted to, and the place where it gets complicated now is if we're gonna accept the idea that there's a spectrum of genders, then that completely blows up our language, any language we would use to try to capture our different sexual orientations.
Exactly, and that's where the confusion
Right.
gets involved, and that's what I run into.
I've often used the infographic. There's the gender unicorn.
Oh, I don't know that one.
I will show you, it's amazing. They used to use the genderbread man and then it was the genderbread person, but now they've changed it so it's not really a person at all, so people can kind of relate to it as this entity rather than like
Right.
a person. It's the
See,
gender
this is
unicorn.
what I love.
It's fantastic, but it breaks up, it is not a binary at all.
Right.
And so
Right.
that's what it really shows through this, and it shows
Right.
the heart and the brain and gender identity and gender expression and
So sometimes for somebody who grew up
good graphic.
in a world, in a time when things were all very lined up and very simplified, sometimes it can really hurt their heads to try to figure this stuff out. And I think that, it helps to be patient and to just try again and share stories and things like that. And eventually they start to get it. Yeah. Let's see. I don't know who had their hand up first. Okay.
Just like I feel like as students, like you said that you had to like speak for the students, and I think
Well, I thought I did.
okay.
In
Well-
fact, they were already speaking for themselves. I just didn't know that.
Okay. Well, I guess like something that I run into is that as a student, I feel like I do have a bit of a smaller voice, and that when I do try to speak up, in general, it becomes more of like I'm a fly on the wall that's just gonna go away in a couple of years, rather than like actually trying to bring up an issue that is like not just affecting me. And I feel like that it's like something that can kind of cross many fields, not just like gender. It comes across in like in all the different types of like places that we're trying to fight for civil rights kind of stuff.
Yep. Absolutely. And I think the most important thing Horton did, he didn't try to speak for the Who's. What he said was he believed the Who's were real. And he believed in their voices. And so that's really what I try to do most of the time. Usually when I thunder in there and try to speak for the students, it doesn't really help very much. And I just do it out of frustration sometimes. Yeah. Yeah.
I want to start off by saying that I certainly respect everyone regardless of who they are. But I just have a quick question. I think you kind of briefly brought this up. How do you deal with people that think differently than you on your views and things? Because that's the thing, but if people don't agree.
Right, absolutely.
Because
Yes.
for me, I appreciate there won't be people that always agree with what you're saying.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. And it is really important to have everybody's voice heard, unless somebody's voice is being used only to silence others, right? That's the one place where it becomes really important to be thinking about what feels like oppression. Because usually if oppression is happening, we can feel it, right? If somebody's starting to blow a lot of smoke and try to be very self-important and scary and intimidating, and the result is that a whole group of people feel like they can't have their voices anymore, that's when then it's time to mediate that situation so that everybody gets to speak. And if somebody wants to say why they were being so intimidating and what their real concerns are in a way that can give everybody room to speak, then we've got to hear what they have to say too. Right?
Okay.
But do you see the difference?
Yeah, no, I mean, what would you say then intimidating would be? What's your...
So okay, what I mean by that is that if somebody wants to come forward and say, look, we've got a lot of really important things that we need to spend our funds on and spend our time on, well, that's a real concern, right? And I think it's just like, anybody here from Vermont? Have you ever attended a town meeting?
I'm going on Tuesday.
Going tomorrow.
That is such an excellent experience, because what you will
Tomorrow.
learn is that it's possible to have a civil discussion about issues that matter to every single person in that town. And sometimes it's, should we give up that piece of town land to expand the town cemetery? Should we raise more money so that we can have a second police officer, so we have somebody on duty at night? Because, you know, we don't have an EMT that can make it all the way out here, and what if somebody's having a heart attack, and whatever the subject is. But what you find out is that there really is a difference between somebody who's yelling really loud just so that other people can't be heard versus somebody who's raising an argument against what I'm saying or what you're saying,
Yeah.
that deserves to be heard. There is a difference.
Like how there can be differences there.
That's right. That's right. And those differences, we need to make space for those differences. I'm asking that we make space for the folks who want to say, wait a minute, just because this is what the theory always has been, what about this piece of lived experience is not getting included in that? And so, of course, I want to make space for that teacher to express why it's hard for them to hear that. I just don't want them to summarily dismiss it, right? Or to use their privilege to keep that opinion from being expressed in the first place.
Yeah.
Yes and yes.
I feel like you talked about having goals and kind of keeping them to the periphery and then coming back to them, and
Yeah.
I wonder how you define those goals clearly so that you can remember them. I feel like that's part
Yeah.
of the battle, is like
Yeah.
not clearly knowing where you're going with activism and trying to do things but not having an effective way of saying, like, this is what we're going for, or these
Right.
5 things are what we're going for.
Yeah.
And then, you know, saying as a group that we're doing that and all attacking it in different ways. But
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense.
No,
If
it's
that's
really
a reasonable
tough.
question.
It's really tough,
Yeah.
and I think that I don't consider there are folks who can be incredibly charismatic and they can inspire a group. And that's not exactly the way I function. I'm more of a facilitator. Right? It's important to know what kind of agent we are. We're all agents, right? And some of us are the ones who are like out in the front, you know, of the boat, you know, helping everybody have the energy to row. That's that charismatic leader, right? I'm more of a facilitator. I'm good at going around and finding out who has blisters and who can swap out for the next person and who has a back problem and maybe needs, you know, whatever, you know. I'm a facilitator. And so that's what I'm good at. I don't think that we're all good at the same things. But it works for me to track the energy, right? To find out, to get to know people well enough to find out what they're excited about, what they're good at, what they're interested in, what they want to learn more about, and then I put people together, you know, or I recruit people to try something that they haven't tried before. And so I just really believe that if we create conditions where people feel freer, they do more. And so, for example, when I say don't beat your head against the wall, I knew it was going to be really hard to get that preferred name field changed, to get the name and pronoun thing dealt with at UVM. I knew that was going to be a hard one. But what we were able to get done the very first summer was to change out all the bathroom signs. And so what I did was help them know which bathrooms were really important. You know, I facilitated. And then I made sure that I took on the responsibility of getting that information out to the students. And I made a point of having a spreadsheet and a map and posting that on my webpage. I did that work. I facilitated that flow of information. Right? I took on that responsibility, and what that did was change the way transgender students were feeling on our campus. They were feeling like somebody was listening to them, and that somebody cared about their safety and their comfort and their inclusion, and guess what happened? They spoke up more, right? So that's the way I think about it, is that I think about what is my role, what is my responsibility. I didn't have to be the one who took on that information. I could have decided it was the dean of students' job or something, right? But I thought, this is something I can do, and I can see how this is my responsibility as the director of the LGBTQA Center to make sure that the community has access to this information. And then it has this, you know, like snowball rolling downhill effect, that it gets bigger, it gains momentum. So that's how I do it. Yes, and then yes.
Okay, you said something about, so on the flyer, that's posted, like one of many posters on campus, but you, what do you mean when you suggest that you think that, basically we need to change the, like, you said something about that, about a society, about something needing to be done. I mean, I'm trying to think for that exact word. Like about like how you think that like a society is something that seems to say that society is going like downhill. I don't know. I was trying to figure out like.
What I'm talking about is that I think that we've come through a long period of time where we've tended to trust authority figures to kind of have everything sewn up and have the answers to things. And I think what's happening is that we're reaching a point in the history of the human activity on the planet where we've kind of gotten ourselves into some messes in terms of how we imagine governance and economics and education and ecology and all these things that are kind of complicated. They're pretty complicated. And so there are a lot of human beings on the planet right now who are not doing so well and maybe could be doing better, could be have more food to eat and be more secure and those kinds of things. But I don't think that we're going to be able to rely on a few people in positions of authority to fix everything. I think it's going to have to be much more of a group effort, that we're going to have to work together as ordinary people to figure out some of the most complicated problems that face us. I don't think we can sit back and assume that the people who've found themselves in leadership positions to have all the answers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I forgot exactly, I can get my question, I just forgot exactly, it has something along those lines.
Okay. You had your hand up and then...
Yeah, well, I was trying to figure out how do we have a nuanced and productive conversation like this in the classroom. And I will just let you know, like an assumption is that a liberal arts space has these kind of dialogues, but that is absolutely not, I think, something that's a given. And I think that,
maybe a little bit better, but not.
yeah, it's a little bit better, definitely. I'm sure it's better than like something in more of a state college situation, but it isn't a given if most of the people in the room have a normative idea of what it means, like gender or class or whatever. And when your professor is also just like learning it from a book, there tends to be this issue of just like a really kind of black and white, like this yes and no, this is bad. Especially I'm thinking about a very like overly liberalized idea of like it almost like makes it so that they want to get to the good feeling faster. So it's like, you know, this is a bad thing, this is a good thing, and we just wish that this could be good, and then we want to move on. But it's like there's so many nuances. I just wonder, like you're talking about microaggressions. I've never seen something like that in a landmark classroom, and I've been here for 2 years. But I know about this because I have to know about these things. But I mean, that's not that wasn't common knowledge for somebody to see that. And so I'm just thinking, where does that come into our education? Like that's what I think of when you're saying queering education is like, yes. Why isn't this should be a part of our general idea of like looking at everything, our critical analysis, but
Right.
How do you do that? Do you go to the administration? Do you talk to professors? Is it a ground up thing? Do students ask them, you know, like how does this happen? Because I would love to see that. That would make my educational experience way more productive, you know, because I wouldn't have to tell every peer what it means, you know, when they say this, but they can also have been learning it in class, so
Right.
that kind of thing.
You got to bingo, right? You know, what is the thing for what she said? Whatever.
Ditto.
Right. Ditto. Yes. That's exactly it. That is the essence of what I was trying to say. See, you should have said it. But seriously, what I have been sort of seeing in this swimming, holistic thinking swamp of a head of mine is exactly what you're talking about, is that somehow we together, and I don't think that the teacher should be responsible for doing this by themselves, right? I think that's part of the problem, is imagining, we've been taught to imagine teaching and learning taking place in this way that I don't think can get us there. I don't think one person can lead this process. I think that there's this responsibility that we have to dream on this and wake up and come to understand a different way of doing it that's going to help us move to this new space where we're teaching each other. And I think we've got to discover it together. You know?
How do you think we should begin that? Do you have any ideas?
The first one is to keep calling out what this way that education has become institutionalized. You know, we need to get it back down to the human project of learning. And I'm not, you know, so all the institutionalization has to do with, you know, the companies that are making $1 gazillion printing your textbooks and charging you too much for them, and there are too many big interests with too much to lose right now, and you know, the Western world has had too much influence, honestly, on the shape that education takes, particularly higher education, with the you know, defining what is the classical canon of all whatever, you know, and to the extent that they would refuse to even talk about some of the ancient wisdom that was built in India and China while Europeans were still sacking and looting and pillaging. You know, like, there's this way that we have narrowly defined what knowledge is, that has so much built around it. And I don't mean to say that the classical ideas that have been taught from in philosophy don't have value. And I'm not saying that every single classics program doesn't take into account some of those other philosophical traditions. But there's been too much that has been built too narrowly and has become too imbued with status and power, and not just the process, the human process of learning. And it just needs to be brought back into a scalable space. And I think young people and students in classrooms have got to be part of leading that conversation, you know, of making those critical observations about, you know, appreciating the knowledge that is being shared, because it matters, right? Just like we as a nation had to understand each other across the, you know, we had to have a common English language back in colonial America in order to be able to talk to each other. We have to start from a place of being informed. We can't just say, you know, I disagree, and then not be able to say why. We have to educate ourselves and understand, grow to understand why this feels wrong, so that we can then articulate that in a way that will get through to that professor who is having a hard time seeing their own blinders, right? Does that, I don't, you know, I'm sorry if I just repeated myself, but.
It's interesting, the authority versus the people, because it's often a good thing, but I can't help but think of times where it just being where it can be damaging the public. Vaccines is a prime example. There's the crazy anti-vaccine people who, despite tremendous evidence, refuse to listen to doctors who have studied this and done study after study. And that's where it's, but I feel like what we have to do is have everyone has to be able to check. You have to, I feel like you should trust the research. You don't need to trust, you don't look to the researcher, look to the research. You don't, and that's where.
Right.
If the research shows, and that's why I think people like to forget that, just because a bit of evidence was put, I feel like some people take what we're saying and misconstrue it so much to make it to where they're being crazy and not listening to people who know a hell of a lot more about something than they do.
Right, and that's where I want to get back to your question. I see a connection there. Because for me, I just want to encourage every single one of you to trust your gut. You know, your gut is actually a real brain process going on. That feeling that you get that something's not right here is a real brain process going on. You're picking up cues and you're feeling something that says, you know, I'm not comfortable with this. That doesn't mean that you need to necessarily get reactive in that moment and, you know, stand up on the desk and I'm not going to take this and, you know, make a big...
Your initial reaction is to go into it.
That's right. You want to check that out.
Because
you want to step back.
Because if the people who went with their gut reactions about vaccines actually looked into it, they would realize they're extremely safe.
Wait, no, I know, this is the thing, I think that's the problem, like, the gut reaction to that person is that it is wrong, like, there's, like, to imagine that somebody else can have a gut reaction that's not yours is absolutely human, like, that's.
That's right, that's
But
right.
it's just, it's to reflect on your gut reaction, not to think that your gut reaction is right, your
That's
gut
right.
reaction is just a
That's
reaction.
right.
That's the mistake most people.
But you want to check it out and
people
figure
make.
out where it's coming from. And I want to follow up what you said about research and trusting the research. The problem is that if you do your homework, you find out that research has also been used to lie,
And that's what I think,
right? And so you have to be critical about everything.
Yeah, science is a religion.
That's right. Science has been used to do some very oppressive things.
Yeah.
And so you have to get curious, ask your own questions, do your own digging, and find out for yourself when you're satisfied, and not just accept whole cloth what's being handed to you.